The blackout that struck the city of Delmay wasn't just a sudden loss of electricity. It was the beginning of the strangest psychological and possibly supernatural event the city had ever experienced. When the power grid collapsed at 2:14 a.m., people expected a typical outage. A few hours of inconvenience, maybe some confusion, maybe a little panic. But what followed had nothing to do with electricity at all. It had to do with identity itself. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the darkness. Darkness people could handle. It was the moment residents tried to interact with each other. Husbands looked at their wives and couldn't remember what to call them. Parents stayed at their children like they were meeting them for the first time. Friends, co-workers, strangers, it didn't matter. Every personal name had evaporated from everyone's mind at the exact same moment the lights went out. It was like a collective mental wipe, precise and targeted. People still remembered everything else. They remembered how to drive, how to read, where they lived, and what they liked or disliked. Memories of experiences remained intact. They remembered vacations, arguments, birthdays, just not the names attached to the people in those memories. Someone might recall laughing with a person on a beach, might even remember what they were wearing and what they talked about, but not the simple, fundamental identity marker that tied the memory to reality. The name was missing like a puzzle piece that had been intentionally removed. The strangest part was how universal it was. There wasn't a single unaffected person in the entire city. Not one. Everyone woke up or walked outside and realized the same terrifying truth. They had become nameless beings surrounded by other nameless beings, all struggling to understand why their minds had betrayed them. And the moment people tried to fix it, by asking others for their names, by writing names down, by repeating them, something kept erasing the information again. It was like the concept of names simply couldn't stick anymore, as though the mind had been rewired to reject them. Panic grew quickly. People felt disconnected from the people they loved, not emotionally but fundamentally. Names are anchors. They make relationships real and grounded. Without them, everything became fuzzy and uncertain. Couples who had been together for decades felt suddenly like strangers. Parents clung to children out of instinct, not recognition. Even pets didn't escape the confusion. Owners couldn't remember what they called the dogs or cats, and animals reacted nervously to the shift in human behavior. But the true horror wasn't just the forgetting. It was the eerie calmness that came with it. People weren't losing random memories. They weren't confused about the world. Life continued, more or less, in the practical sense. People still cooked breakfast, still walked outside, still recognized their houses and their routines. It was only the part of identity tied to names, labels, titles, forms of personal identification, that had been wiped clean. The blackout didn't just remove power. It removed the most human part of connection, the ability to name, recognize, and claim the people who mattered. One of the most unsettling parts of the Delmay blackout wasn't just that every name disappeared from people's minds. It was the impossibility of bringing those names back. It didn't matter how hard someone tried, how often they repeated a name, or even if they wrote it clearly in bold letters, right in front of their face. The information simply refused to stay. It was as if names had become slippery, like trying to hold water in your hands. You could recognize that it was there in the moment, but seconds later, it would slide away again, leaving only the faint sense that something was missing. This wasn't the kind of memory loss people usually deal with. It wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't even like a dream fading after you wake up. It was something far more precise, almost surgical, as if the human brain had suddenly been programmed to reject anything related to identity labels. Every attempt to relearn a name ended the same way. The person would hear it, understand it, sometimes even feel relieved for a moment, and then the meaning would dissolve. The sound of the word remained, but the connection behind it vanished. Doctors tried to test the phenomenon. They had people write their names on paper. They had them speak their names into battery-powered recorders. They had them trace letters with their fingers, whisper the names to themselves repeatedly, even try to memorize them using techniques designed for stroke patients or individuals with cognitive loss. But the outcome was always identical. After a few minutes, the word became meaningless. People could read the letters, but couldn't attach the word to themselves. It was like looking at your own name in a foreign language you'd never seen before. The failure wasn't in short-term memory or long-term memory. Those systems were intact. People still remember decades of life experience with perfect clarity. They remember how to perform their jobs, how to navigate the city, how to cook meals, how to think logically. Only the category of names had been erased, and any attempt to restore it was overwritten. It was as if a filter had been placed over every human mind in Delmere, blocking out that specific type of information. Some residents tried clever tricks, hoping they could outsmart whatever force was doing this. One person carved their name into wooden planks. Another tattooed it on their forearm. Others wrote it thousands of times in notebooks or repeated it aloud like a chant. But whether it was written, spoken, recorded, or carved, the moment they looked away, their mind slipped back into the same blank state. They saw the letters, but their brain refused to connect them to identity. A man could stare at his own name for 10 minutes straight, and the moment he blinked, the recognition vanished again. This selective erasure caused fear far deeper than the blackout itself. Losing power is frightening but understandable. Losing a fundamental mental function, one so specific and universal, felt unnatural, intentional. People started whispering theories: a neurological attack, a mass psychological event, radiation, an experimental weapon, even something paranormal. But nothing could explain why only names were affected. Names aren't stored in one single spot in the brain. They're connected to emotion, memory, language, and association. So for them to vanish so cleanly meant that whatever caused this wasn't random. The city wasn't just dealing with a power outage. It was dealing with the collapse of a core part of human identity. And the harder people tried to hold onto names, the faster those names slipped away, as if something was actively removing them. For the first few days of the blackout, Delmere was gripped by fear, confusion, and a kind of emotional numbness that spread like fog. But everything shifted on the third night, when something appeared in the sky, something that no one could fully explain, and something that, disturbingly, most people couldn't even remember afterward unless they had written it down. Around 3 a.m., while the city slept in pitch-black silence, faint lights began to drift above the rooftops. They weren't bright like lightning or chaotic like sparks. They were thin, delicate, almost hair-like strands of white light moving slowly across the sky, as if carried by an invisible current. People described them as floating threads, shimmering filaments, or pieces of moonlight that got loose. They didn't blink or flicker like aircraft, and they didn't behave like any natural phenomenon. They drifted with intention, almost like they were scanning the city. Hundreds of people across different neighborhoods claimed they saw them, and despite the blackout shutting down all communication, their descriptions were eerily identical. These strands weren't massive, not like giant beams blazing across the sky. They were gentle, almost beautiful, until they touched the ground. Witnesses said that whenever one of these glowing strands reached down and brushed against a building, the street, or even a person, something strange happened. Not physically, there were no burns, no marks, no sounds. But mentally, there was a sudden surge of emotion. Some described it as an overwhelming wave of nostalgia, a memory of something they couldn't quite place. Others felt sudden fear without a clear reason, as if remembering a nightmare they never had. A few said they felt like they were being watched, evaluated, or examined. The strangest part was that people who were touched by the strands reported feeling like someone whispered their name, but the moment they tried to listen, the name slipped out of reach. It was like hearing your identity spoken from a distance, but the sound was swallowed by silence before it reached your ears. Some residents tried following the lights. They wandered through empty streets with flashlights and lanterns, calling out into the darkness, hoping to find where the strands were coming from. Others barricaded themselves inside, convinced that the lights weren't natural at all, that they were some kind of signal or probe or presence searching for something specific within the city. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect wasn't the lights themselves. It was the forgetting. By morning, almost everyone who witnessed the strands had lost a memory of them entirely. Their minds simply wiped the event clean. The only reason the phenomenon is known at all is because a handful of people wrote down what they saw in notebooks, journals, or scraps of paper before falling asleep. When they woke up, they were horrified to discover their own handwriting describing an experience they didn't remember living through. Those notes shared patterns, lights in the sky. Don't let them touch you. Something is watching. They're searching for someone. The people who wrote these messages couldn't explain how they knew these things. They only knew that their words didn't feel like guesses. They felt like warnings. To this day, the glowing strands are one of the biggest mysteries of the Delmere blackout. Were they hallucinations triggered by stress? An unknown atmospheric reaction to the blackout? A shared dream? Or were they something conscious, something that moved through the sky with purpose? Whatever they were, they came and went without leaving physical evidence. But they left behind a chilling truth. Something visited the city that night. And whatever it was, it seemed to be looking for something or someone. While adults struggled helplessly to hold onto the vanished identities of the people around them, something extraordinary and completely unexpected began to unfold among the children of Delmere. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a strange coincidence. A 7-year-old boy ran to his mother on the 4th morning of the blackout and called her by her actual name. Not a nickname, not a guess. Her real name, the one even she had forgotten. She froze, stunned. She tried repeating it, terrified she would lose it again, but unlike every attempt before, the name stayed. It didn't slip away. It didn't vanish. It anchored itself back into her mind as if it had never been missing. At first, people assumed the boy had simply remembered sooner than the adults. Maybe children were more resilient, or maybe their memories worked differently. But within hours, dozens of kids across the city were doing the same thing, calling out names with absolute certainty, naming their parents, their siblings, their teachers, their neighbors, names that no adult could recall. And the truly impossible part, children began naming people they had never met. A little girl in the Northern District pointed at a man walking down the street and said his name out loud. The man stopped, shocked, because the name was correct. She shouldn't have known it. She had never seen him before. But she said it with the same casual confidence as if she were pointing to a color or an animal, like it was obvious. More reports flooded in. Kids were walking through parks, through grocery stores, through apartment courtyards, touching people's hands and softly saying their names. And every name stuck immediately for the adults. The second a child spoke it, the recognition slammed back into place. Memories reconnected, relationships reformed, emotions surged back like a broken dam fixing itself in an instant. People sobbed. People hugged strangers who were no longer strangers. It was as if the kids were repairing a shattered map of human identity. When adults asked the children how they were doing this, the answers were even more unsettling than the phenomenon itself. They didn't say they remembered the names. They didn't say the names came back in a rush or from memory. Instead, they described something invisible, something only they seemed able to perceive during the blackout. They said the names were floating around people. Not written, not spoken, floating. One child described them as little strings of light tied to people's heads. Another said they looked like labels made of smoke. One particularly articulate 11-year-old said it felt like walking through a fog of words, where every person carried a faint glowing thread that contained their identity. All the kids had to do was reach out, grab the thread, and speak it aloud. Whatever force had erased the name seemed unable, or unwilling, to affect the youngest minds. Some adults theorized that children's brains, still developing, had more flexibility or fewer mental defenses. Others believed children were simply more open to the strange and the unexplainable. But there was another theory whispered quietly among survivors, one that made the hair on their arms stand up. Maybe the children weren't unaffected. Maybe they were chosen. Because every child described these floating threads appearing only after the blackout, as if something had coated the city in an invisible layer of identity waiting to be rediscovered. And the children, for reasons no one understood, were the only ones who could see it. By the end of the blackout, the kids of Delmere had restored thousands of names, patching the city's fractured sense of self in a way no adult mind could manage. But long after the power returned, after the crisis faded, parents whispered about one last strange detail the children shared. They said the glowing name threads didn't disappear when the blackout ended. They simply dimmed, as if waiting for the lights to go out again. Even after the lights came back on and Delmere tried to return to something that looked like normal, the city carried a strange residue, an uneasiness that clung to the air like dust after a demolition. People remembered their names again, thanks to the children. Streets filled with chatter, shops reopened, and life appeared to resume. But beneath that surface calm, behind every casual greeting and forced smile, there was a question that no one could shake. Who, or what, erased everyone's name in the first place? And why did it stop? Every expert who tried studying the blackout ran into the same dead ends. Scientists couldn't explain the sudden citywide memory wipe. The strands of light witnessed in the sky left no trace. The only physical documentation consisted of shaky handwriting in notebooks that even their authors didn't fully remember writing. Nothing added up. Theories were built and torn down in the same breath. Some insisted it was mass psychological trauma. Others whispered about electromagnetic disturbances. Government officials hinted at classified atmospheric interference, which did nothing except make people more suspicious. But residents of Delmere, the people who lived through the eerie silence, the glowing threads, the vanishing names, felt, deep down, that it was none of those things. Especially because of what started happening weeks after the blackout ended. It began with dreams. People described hearing whispers in their sleep. Not clear voices, not words, but soft murmurs, like distant conversations echoing through a long hallway. Sometimes the voices sounded familiar. Sometimes they didn't. A few residents claimed they heard their own names being spoken in their dreams, but always from behind them. When they turned around, they woke up instantly. Then came the sightings. Shadows moving at the far end of hallways. Figures standing at the edge of streetlights that vanished if you looked directly at them. Pets growling at empty corners. Children pointing at blank spaces and saying things like, "Someone's standing there." Parents would swear nothing was there, yet they felt watched all the same. The most chilling encounters happened to the people who lived alone. Several reported waking up to find unfamiliar words written on mirrors in the early morning fog. Some found objects moved around their homes, chairs pulled out, books left open, doors that were closed the night before now standing slightly ajar. Nothing dangerous, nothing violent, just wrong. One man claimed that every time he turned off the lights in his home, he heard faint footsteps behind him. He never saw anyone, but each night, the steps came closer. And then there were the children. They stopped talking about the glowing name threads they once saw. Not because they forgot, but because they seemed to know something had changed. When adults asked them whether they could still see those glowing threads, most children answered quietly, "Not anymore." But a few gave a different answer, one that made the entire city uneasy. They said the threads were still there, just farther away, as if whatever once hovered over Delmere had retreated, but not disappeared, as if it were watching from a distance, waiting. One child summed it up in a way that sent chills through every adult who heard it. The names aren't floating around people now. Where are they? Up above us. Even today, long after the blackout ended, there are nights when the power flickers in Delmere. Just for a second, barely noticeable. But during those flickers, dozens of people across the city report the same terrifying sensation. A whisper, a tug at the back of the mind, a feeling like their name is drifting away again, waiting for the moment the lights go out. So whatever came before can finish what it started.